The mist did not so much descend upon Blackwood Lake as it did emerge from it, a great, slow exhalation of vapor that began each evening as the sun bled away behind the Dartmoor tors. By morning, the village would be suffocated, a ghost settlement adrift on a sea of white, the world reduced to the sound of dripping water and the occasional mournful cry of a gull lost inland. It was on such a morning, the 17th of October 1895, that the silence broke, though not with any clamor. It broke with an absence. The Harrison family was gone. The news reached me not by a frantic summons, but through the concerned gossip of Mrs. Drabble, my housekeeper, as she laid the fire in my study. Her voice was hushed, as if the mist itself demanded quiet. "They're saying at the post office, Vicar, that the schoolmaster didn't open the schoolhouse this morning. And young Clara Harrison wasn't at her lessons with the other children yesterday afternoon. It's not like them, sir. Not like them at all." A coldness that had little to do with the damp morning seized me. Charles Harrison was a man of rigid punctuality, a pillar of quiet order in our small community. His wife, Eleanor, was the embodiment of gentle diligence, her hands as skilled with a needle as they were with the cultivation of the roses that climbed the stone wall of their cottage. And their daughters, Clara, 10, and Flora, 7, were the very pictures of childhood innocence, their laughter a familiar music after Sunday services. Their cottage, a humble but proud structure of local granite, stood alone on the northern shore of the lake, a sentinel facing the vast, often brooding, expanse of water. I dispatched a boy to fetch Constable Davies and made my way to the Harrisons' home myself. The path along the lake was slick with wet leaves, the water a flat, gray sheet of polished lead, invisible beyond a few yards from the shore. The cottage, when it loomed out of the fog, had a stillness about it that was palpable. No smoke curled from the chimney. The curtains in the parlor window were drawn tight. I knocked, the sound unnaturally loud in the muffled world. When no answer came, I tried the iron latch. The door swung inwards with a groan. The scene within was one of interrupted domesticity, so normal it was chilling. The main room, which served as kitchen, dining, and parlor, was neat and orderly. A fire had been laid in the hearth but not lit, and on the sturdy oak table lay the evidence of a meal that had never been eaten. For places were set. Plates held portions of cold mutton pie, congealed gravy glistening in the weak light filtering through the curtains. A loaf of bread sat beside a knife, a single slice cut from it. A bowl of stewed apples, skin turning brown, stood sentinel in the center. 4 cups, empty. A teapot, still in its woolen cozy, felt cold to the touch. It was a tableau of anticipation frozen in time. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned chair, no dropped utensil. It was as if the family had simply risen as one and walked out into the twilight, leaving their supper behind. Constable Davies arrived shortly after, his broad, pragmatic face creased with worry. He methodically searched the cottage, his heavy boots echoing on the flagstones. Upstairs, the beds were neatly made, the children's toys, a wooden horse, a stack of books, Clara's beloved doll with its porcelain face, arranged with a child's care. Nothing was amiss. It was in the small garden, leading down to the lake's edge, that we found the first, faint clue. Partially obscured by a clump of reeds, lay a single, small object, Clara's porcelain-faced doll. It was not broken, nor was it tossed aside. It was placed upright on a flat stone, its glassy eyes staring out across the impenetrable gray water, its little lace dress sodden with dew. It looked less like a lost toy and more like an offering. The constable organized a search party. Men with lanterns and anxious voices scoured the surrounding woods and fields, their calls swallowed by the fog. I remained by the lake, staring into the blankness. The villagers, huddled in small groups, spoke in low tones. I caught fragments of their conversations, words that made my blood run cold. Happened before my time, but my grandfather told the tale. Every 50 years, they say. The lady takes a family, the mist is her cloak. She walks in it. I chastised them for their superstition. We are men of reason and faith, I said, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. There will be a logical explanation. But as the day wore on and the search yielded nothing, The logical explanations began to feel flimsy. A sudden journey? They had taken nothing. An accident? There was no sign of one. Foul play? By whom, and to what end? The Harrisons had no enemies. As dusk began to bleed the little light from the sky, the searchers returned, their faces grim and defeated. The Harrisons had vanished from the face of the earth. The only testament to their existence was a cold supper, a neatly kept cottage, and a doll staring blindly into the mist. That night, in the silence of the vicarage, I opened my journal to make my entry. The words came slowly. For the first time in my 20 years as shepherd of this flock, I felt a fear that was not of God, but of the ancient, pagan silence that lay upon the water and the land. The tapestry of our orderly lives had been pulled, and a dark thread was beginning to unravel. The following 2 days were an exercise in agonizing suspension. The fog clung to Blackwood Lake with a tenacity that felt malicious, a palpable barrier to both sight and progress. The search parties continued their work, but their efforts were hopeless, men stumbling through a world reduced to shades of gray, their voices muffled as if the very air conspired to hide the truth. The mood in the village curdled from concern into a quiet, superstitious dread. Doors were locked before nightfall. Parents kept their children close. The Harrisons' absence became a void that seemed to suck all sound and light from our community. I spent those days attempting to minister to a congregation that looked to me for answers I did not possess. My sermons on faith and God's plan felt like empty platitudes in the face of such inexplicable horror. I visited the Harrison cottage again, alone, hoping to find some overlooked detail. The untouched meal still sat on the table, the food now beginning to spoil, a cruel mockery of domestic life. The silence within the walls was profound, broken only by the frantic beating of my own heart. I stood at the door, looking down at the doll on the stone by the water's edge. It seemed to me now that its vacant gaze was not one of innocence lost, but of cold accusation. On the morning of the third day, the 19th of October, the fog finally began to lift, retreating back across the lake in ragged tendrils. It was then that old John Crocker made his grim discovery. John was a man of the water, his face leathered by a lifetime of wind and weather, his movements as slow and deliberate as the tides. He was mending his nets on the small wooden jetty, his gnarled fingers working the twine with an age-old rhythm, when he felt an unnatural weight on one of his long-set lines. He hauled it in hand over hand, his brow furrowed. It was not the struggling weight of a fish, but a heavy, sodden drag. Wrapped in the green, slimy netting was a small, pale form. It was Flora Harrison. Her body was dressed in the same white Sunday pinafore she had worn just days before, now clinging to her tiny frame like a shroud. Her blonde hair was fanned out like a halo of wet straw. There were no visible wounds, no marks of violence that spoke of a struggle. Her face was peaceful, almost serene, but waxy and pale as alabaster. The only anomaly, the only sign that this was not a mere tragic drowning, was a faint, bluish discoloration around her lips, like a smudge of forgotten berries, and a mark upon her wrist. Constable Davies was summoned, and I followed him to the jetty. A small, horrified crowd had gathered, held back by a few grim-faced men. I knelt beside the small body, the cold of the stone seeping through my trousers. The mark on her wrist was unmistakable. It was a pattern of 3 interlocking circles, etched into the skin with an unnatural precision. It was not a cut or a bruise. The skin was unbroken. It looked as if it had been branded there by a cold iron, a symbol of perfect, geometric finality. A collective shudder ran through the onlookers. I heard a woman gasp, "The lady's mark." My hands trembled as I performed the rites of the dead, the Latin prayers feeling ancient and powerless against this fresh, specific evil. The constable, his face a mask of professional stoicism, ordered the dragging of the lake. A flat-bottomed boat was brought out, and men with grapnels began the grim task of probing the depths. The water, now clear of fog, was dark and peat-stained, revealing nothing of its secrets. The discovery of Flora confirmed our worst fears, yet it provided no answers. It only deepened the mystery. How had she come to be in the water? Where were the others? The symbol on her wrist burned in my mind. I retreated to the vicarage library, pulling down dusty volumes on local folklore and heraldry. I found nothing resembling the triple circle. It was a sigil of no church, no noble house. It felt older, more primal. That evening, as I tried to eat the supper Mrs. Drabble had left for me, I found I had no appetite. The image of the little girl, so peaceful in death, yet marked by that inexplicable symbol, haunted me. The rational world of scripture and law was receding, replaced by the chilling certainty that we were dealing with something far older than Christianity, something that slept in the deep, dark water of the lake and had, for reasons beyond our comprehension, awakened and taken the Harrison family. The search for a logical explanation was over. We were now in the realm of the unthinkable. The Lady of the Lake was no longer a folk tale, she had left her calling card. The dragging of the lake commenced with a grim, ceremonial solemnity. The flat-bottomed boat, usually employed for harvesting reeds or setting eel traps, became a vessel of morbid inquiry. 2 men, the blacksmith, Joseph Ainsworth, and the farmer, George Miller, took up the long, iron-tipped grapnels. Their faces were set in masks of stoic determination, but I saw the fear in their eyes, a fear that mirrored my own. The rest of the village stood along the shore, a silent, watchful congregation gathered for a liturgy of despair. The water, newly revealed by the retreating fog, was a sheet of dark, peat-stained glass, reflecting the leaden sky. It gave nothing away. The grapnels were cast out with a splash that echoed unervingly in the hush. They would sink into the unknown, and the men would then haul them back, hand over hand, their muscles straining against the weight of water and hope. The first few passes brought up only weeds and rotting branches, their tangled forms momentarily sparking dread before revealing their benign nature. With each empty retrieval, the tension on the shore tightened. There was a collective, unspoken desire to find nothing, for the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. It was on the 7th or 8th pass that Ainsworth's grapnel caught. It was not the snag of a submerged log, it was a heavier, more yielding resistance. "I've got something," he grunted, his voice tight. Miller moved to help him, and together they began to pull, their backs straining. The rope grew taut, cutting a furrow through the dark water. A collective intake of breath swept through the crowd. I found myself stepping closer to the water's edge, my prayer book clutched like a shield. The shape that broke the surface was a blur of dark wool and pale flesh. It was Charles Harrison. The grapnel had caught him cruelly in the meat of his shoulder, and the water streamed from his clothes as he was dragged towards the shore. He was a large man, and it took 4 men to lift his sodden body onto the gravel. His face was a mask of awful peace, but his eyes were wide open, staring at the sky with a fixed, blank astonishment. Like his daughter, there were no obvious signs of a violent end. And like his daughter, there was a mark. This one was on the back of his right hand, the same 3 interlocking circles, etched into the skin with the same chilling precision. A wave of nausea passed over me. I stumbled forward, dropping to my knees beside the schoolmaster's body. The symbol seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. I reached out a trembling hand, not to touch it, but as if to verify its reality. The skin was cold, waxy. The constable stood over us, his notebook in hand, but he did not write. What could he possibly record? Cause of death, unknown. Circumstances, impossible. The dragging continued, now with a renewed, feverish horror. The men in the boat worked with a frantic energy, desperate to be done with their ghastly task. Within the hour, they found Eleanor Harrison. She was floating nearer to the surface, her dark hair fanning out around her like a crown of seaweed. Her body was recovered with more dignity, wrapped in a blanket by the women who had come forward, their faces pale but resolute. The mark was on her neck, just below her ear, a delicate, blasphemous piece of jewelry left by her killer. The lake had given up 3 of its victims, but it held fast to the last. Clara, the eldest daughter, remained missing. As the light began to fade, casting long, cold shadows across the water, the search was called off for the day. The bodies of Charles, Eleanor, and Flora were carried to the churchyard and laid in the cold room adjacent to the vestry. I locked the door, the heavy iron key feeling like a brand in my hand. That night, the village of Blackwood Lake was a place of absolute terror. No one walked abroad. Candles burned in every window, but their light seemed feeble against the pressing darkness. I did not sleep. I sat in my study, the ledger open before me, the 3 interlocking circles drawn clumsily in the margin. I had consulted every book I owned. I had found nothing. This was a language of evil I did not understand. The Harrisons had not simply been murdered, they had been marked, branded like livestock. The methodical, symbolic nature of the act pointed to a mind, or a force, of terrifying calculation. The quiet, logical world I had inhabited for 60 years had shattered, and I was adrift in a nightmare, the cold waters of Shadow Lake closing over my head. The 4th victim was still out there. And I knew, with a certainty that froze my soul, that the horror was not over. The days that followed the recovery of 3 of the Harrison family were a suffocating blanket of grief and paranoia. The bodies of Charles, Eleanor, and little Flora lay in the cold, stone-lined room beside the vestry, awaiting burial. But we could not lay them to rest. Not while Clara was still missing. The lake, once the source of life and livelihood for the village, had become a monstrous, silent entity that we all regarded with a mixture of terror and hatred. The dragging continued each day, but the grapnels found only weeds and mud. It was as if the water had swallowed the girl whole and refused to give her back. The constable, a man named Davies whose previously pragmatic demeanor had been replaced by a haunted look, conducted interviews. Had anyone seen strangers in the area? Had there been any arguments? The answers were always the same: nothing. The Harrisons were well-liked, quiet, and kept to themselves. The only whispers were the old ones about the Lady of the Lake, and these whispers grew louder with each passing day. I fought against them from the pulpit, preaching reason, but my words felt hollow even to my own ears. How does one reason with a triple circle brand on a dead child's wrist? It was on the 5th day after the disappearances that the first break in the case occurred, though it was a break that led us down a darker path still. Old John Crocker, the fisherman who had found Flora, came to the vicarage, his cap twisted nervously in his hands. He refused Mrs. Drabble's offer of tea, his eyes fixed on me with an unsettling intensity. "Vicar," he began, his voice a low rumble. "I've not spoken of this to the constable. He's a good man, but he looks for a man's hand in this. I'm not sure that's what we're dealing with." "What do you mean, John?" I asked, gesturing for him to sit. He remained standing. "The night they vanished," he said, "I was out late, checking my lobster pots. The mist was thick, but I know that water blindfolded. I heard something." He paused, swallowing hard. "A song. Coming from out on the lake. A woman's voice, singing. No words I could make out, but a melody, old-sounding. Sad, but beautiful. Beautiful in a way that made your heart ache." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft in the room. "The lady?" I whispered, the superstitious words escaping my lips before I could stop them. John shook his head, a grim certainty in his eyes. "I've lived on this lake my whole life, Vicar. I've heard the stories since I was a boy, but I never put stock in them. Until that night. The song, it wasn't of this world. And then, just for a second, the mist parted. Out near the center of the lake, where the water is deepest, I saw a figure. A woman in white, standing on the water. He saw the disbelief on my face and pressed on. "I'm not a fanciful man, Vicar. I know what I saw. She was there." And then the mist closed up and the singing stopped. He left me then, with a warning to be careful, to not go near the water after dark. I sat for a long time, staring into the fire. A woman singing on the water. A figure in white. It was the stuff of peasant legend, the kind of tale I had dismissed for decades. But John Crocker was the most solid, reliable man in the parish. He was not given to hallucinations or drink. If he said he had seen it, I was compelled to believe that he had seen something. That evening, against my better judgment and John's warning, I walked down to the shore. The Harrisons' cottage stood dark and empty, a monument to the tragedy. The air was cold and still, the surface of the lake like black glass. I stood there for perhaps an hour, listening. I heard only the lap of water against the stones and the beating of my own heart. I was about to turn back, feeling foolish, when I saw it. A light. faint and far out, near the center of the lake. A soft, phosphorescent glow that seemed to pulse gently beneath the surface. It was there for a few seconds, then vanished. My breath caught in my throat. I strained my eyes, but the darkness was absolute. Then, a sound carried across the water. It was faint, but unmistakable. The sound of a child crying. It was Clara. I would have sworn it on a stack of Bibles. A desperate, terrified sobbing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It lasted for only a moment before it was cut off, swallowed by the immense silence of the night. I stood frozen, my blood turned to ice. The rational part of my mind screamed that it was the wind, or a bird, or my own grief-stricken imagination. But I knew it was her. She was still alive. Or something was using her voice to lure us out onto the water. The lake wasn't just a grave, it was a prison. And the thing that held the key was the woman in white. The investigation was no longer about finding a killer. It was about confronting a legend. And I feared that legend was demanding a final, terrible sacrifice before it would release its hold on the last Harrison child. The sound of Clara's crying haunted my every waking moment. It echoed in the silence of the vestry, whispered in the rustle of pages as I prepared my sermon, and tore at my heart during the hollow, strained prayers of my congregation. The village had become a tinderbox of fear. John Crocker's account of the woman in white had spread, mutating with each retelling. Some now claimed to have seen pale faces staring from the depths when they drew water from the well. Others swore the lake water had turned bitter. The practical world was unraveling, its threads snapped by a terror that predated stone churches and prayer books. Constable Davies, to his credit, continued his methodical investigation. He had sent word to Exeter, requesting assistance from the county constabulary. But the roads were poor, and the weather had turned, sealing us in our isolated nightmare. He focused on the tangible, the Harrison cottage. He had men search the surrounding woods again, this time for any sign of a struggle, a discarded weapon, a hidden cache. They found nothing. The earth itself seemed to be protecting the secret. It was during this second search that young Timothy Ainsworth, the blacksmith's son, made a discovery that sent a fresh wave of horror through the community. While beating the undergrowth along a little-used path that skirted the western edge of the lake, he stumbled upon a small, hidden clearing. And in that clearing, partially concealed by ferns, was a makeshift altar. It was a flat-topped stone, stained dark with what looked like old blood. Arranged around it in a precise circle were smooth, water-worn stones, each about the size of a man's fist. But it was what lay upon the altar that made the boy run back to the village, white as a ghost. He had found a collection of small, carefully arranged objects. A lock of Eleanor Harrison's distinctive chestnut hair, tied with a black ribbon. Charles's spectacles, the lenses cracked. A tiny, embroidered handkerchief that had belonged to Flora. And a single, small shoe that was unmistakably Clara's. This was not the work of a random killer or a passing madman. This was ritualistic. This was veneration. The altar spoke of a deliberate, unholy ceremony. The objects were not trophies, they were offerings. Davies brought me to the clearing. The air was colder there, still and heavy. The altar stone felt unnaturally smooth, and the dark stain seemed to seep into the very grain of the rock. I felt a profound sense of desecration, a violation that went beyond murder. This was a place where the old gods, the gods of stone and water that had ruled this land long before the cross, were still being invoked. "We are dealing with something far beyond my understanding, Vicar," Davies admitted, his voice low. He was a man of the law, his world built on evidence and motive. This defied both. This is witchcraft. Or something like it. The word hung in the air between us. Witchcraft. It was a word from the burning times, a word we modern, enlightened men thought we had left behind. But here, in this damp clearing, with the relics of a murdered family laid out like pagan sacraments, it felt terrifyingly apartment. The marks on the bodies, the singing woman, the altar, it all pointed to a belief system, a dark faith that demanded blood sacrifice. We had the constable's men dismantle the altar, gathering the pathetic, heartbreaking objects as evidence. But as we walked back to the village, I knew we had not destroyed anything. We had merely scattered the physical components. The belief, the malevolent will behind it, remained. It was rooted in the lake, in the soil, in the very mist that shrouded us. That night I did not go to the shore. I went to the cold room where the bodies lay. I unlocked the door and stood in the frigid darkness, the scent of damp stone and the faint, sweet odor of death filling my nostrils. I lit a single candle. The 3 shrouded forms lay on stone slabs. I pulled back the cloth from Charles's hand, from Flora's wrist, from Eleanor's neck. The triple circle marks seemed to glow in the flickering light. They were a message. A signature. The killer was not hiding. The killer was proclaiming their work, dedicating it to something ancient and hungry. And Clara was the final piece of the ritual. The living sacrifice. The altar in the woods had confirmed it. We were not just searching for a missing girl. We were in a race against time to prevent a sacrilege that would forever stain this land. The unquiet bones of her family were a silent testament to the fate that awaited her. The lake had taken 3. It was waiting for the 4th. The discovery of the altar shattered what little remained of the village's composure. Fear, which had been a creeping vine, now blossomed into full-grown panic. Where before doors were locked at dusk, now they were barricaded. Men took turns standing watch at night, not with any clear idea of what they were watching for, but with shotguns gripped tightly in white-knuckled hands, their gazes fixed on the oppressive darkness that seemed to pulse from the lake. The children were kept indoors, their games and laughter silenced, their wide eyes reflecting the terror of their parents. Blackwood Lake had become a prison of our own making, the walls forged from dread. The county constabulary from Exeter arrived 2 days later, a Chief Inspector Sterling, a man with a granite jaw and eyes that had seen too much. He brought with him 2 junior detectives and an air of brisk, metropolitan efficiency that felt utterly alien to our suffocating nightmare. He listened to Constable Davies's report, examined the pathetic collection of relics from the altar with a clinical detachment that felt like a desecration in itself, and dismissed the talk of the Lady of the Lake with a derisive snort. Superstition and hysteria, Constable, he declared, his voice cutting through the tense atmosphere of the church hall where we had gathered. We are dealing with a human monster, a particularly cunning and deranged one. This ritualistic nonsense is a smokescreen. The killer is playing on your fears. He ordered a thorough search of every home in the village, looking for blood-stained clothing, hidden weapons, any sign of the killer living among us. His men moved through Blackwood Lake like an invading force, their heavy boots and loud voices profaning the quiet grief of the place. They found nothing, of course. How could they find evidence of a crime when the criminal was the mist on the water and the legend in the air? I watched this with a growing sense of despair. Inspector Sterling was a man trying to capture a ghost with a butterfly net. His methods were designed for the rational world of city streets, not for the ancient, whispering shadows of Dartmoor. He interviewed me at the vicarage, his questions sharp and pointed. Did Charles Harrison have debts? Had Eleanor been unfaithful? Were there any disputes over land? I answered as best I could, but my mind was elsewhere. It was on the triple circle symbol, on John Crocker's testimony, on the crying voice from the lake. Sterling saw my distraction as evasiveness. You seem rather invested in this folklore, Vicar, he remarked, his pen poised over his notebook. A man of God should be a beacon of reason. And a man of the law should be open to all possibilities, Inspector, I replied, perhaps too sharply. Even those that challenge his worldview. The interview ended coldly. He saw me as part of the problem, a superstitious old man feeding the village's panic. I was left alone in my study, the weight of the silence heavier than ever. The authorities were looking in the wrong direction. While they turned over linen chests and questioned farmers about their allegiances, the real evil was out there on the water, growing stronger. I could feel it. The lake had become a presence, a silent, watching entity. The absence of Clara was a scream that only I seemed to hear. Inspector Sterling's investigation stretched into a week, becoming increasingly frustrated and fruitless. The junior detectives grew bored and careless. The village, initially hopeful that outside help would bring answers, now resented the intrusion. The killer, whether man or specter, was laughing at us. The ritual was incomplete, the final offering not yet made, and this interlude of official bumbling felt like a deliberate pause, a drawing out of the agony. The weight of the silence was becoming unbearable. It was a pressure building behind a dam, and I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that when it broke, it would sweep away all of Inspector Sterling's rational theories and leave only the cold, dark truth of the lake. The fourth act of the tragedy was yet to come, and the audience, myself included, was forced to wait in terrified anticipation. Inspector Sterling's presence became a source of friction, a constant reminder of our helplessness. His skepticism was a wall against which our fears beat in vain. He had ordered the dragging of the lake to cease, deeming it morbidly unproductive. The grapnels lay rusting on the jetty, symbols of a search abandoned by official decree. The lake was now off-limits, a crime scene in the eyes of the law, but in our hearts, it had become something far worse, a sacred grove to a malevolent deity. It was on a cold, clear night, the moon a sharp sliver of silver in a black velvet sky, that the silence was broken. I was in my study, attempting to find solace in the Book of Job, when the sound began. It started as a low hum, a vibration that seemed to come up through the stone floor of the vicarage. I thought it was the wind at first, but the night was still. Then it grew, coalescing into that same unearthly singing John Crocker had described. A woman's voice, melodic and achingly sad, weaving through the night air. It was not loud, but it was pervasive, seeping through the cracks in the window frames, impossible to ignore. I rushed to the window. Across the village, I saw other candles flicker to life behind shutters. The singing was coming from the lake. Throwing on my coat, I left the vicarage and moved towards the shore, my heart hammering against my ribs. I was not alone. Shadows detached themselves from cottages. Constable Davies, John Crocker, a handful of other brave or foolish souls, all drawn by the spectral siren song. We gathered on the gravel beach, a small, terrified huddle. The singing was clearer here, echoing across the water. And then we saw her. The lady. She stood in the center of the lake, a figure of shimmering white, seeming to float upon the dark water. The moonlight caught her form, making her glow with an ethereal light. She was tall and graceful, her features indistinct but her presence overwhelmingly real. In her arms, she cradled a small, limp form. A collective gasp went through our group. The girl was pale, her head lolling against the woman's shoulder. She appeared to be asleep or unconscious. The lady raised her head, and though I could not see her eyes, I felt her gaze sweep over us. The singing stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the sound. Then, Inspector Sterling arrived, barging through our group, his revolver drawn. "Nonsense," he shouted, his voice cracking with a fear he tried to mask with anger. "A trick of the light. Some vagrant trying to scare you." He raised his pistol. "You there. Stop in the name of the law." The figure on the water turned its head slowly towards him. It did not speak, but a wave of cold, palpable menace rolled across the lake, striking us like a physical blow. Sterling staggered back, his face ashen. The lady then looked down at the child in her arms. She bent her head, and for a heart-stopping moment, it seemed she would kiss Clara's forehead. Instead, she simply opened her arms. Clara's body fell into the black water with a soft splash that was deafening in the silence. She did not struggle. She sank immediately, swallowed by the depths. A cry of anguish tore from my throat. The lady stood for a moment longer, her form beginning to fade, dissolving like mist in the moonlight. Before she vanished completely, she raised one pale hand and pointed, directly at me. Then she was gone. The lake was once again a sheet of dark, still water. The singing had ceased. Clara was gone. The final sacrifice had been made. Inspector Sterling stood frozen, his pistol hanging limply at his side. All his theories, his rationality, had been shattered before his eyes. He had seen the fourth circle of the mystery completed. The horror was no longer a story, it was a truth he had witnessed. The village men rushed to boats, launching them into the water, but we all knew it was futile. Clara was with her family now. The ritual was over. The lake had claimed what it wanted. And as I stood there, the weight of the lady's pointing finger upon me, I knew with a dreadful certainty that the matter was not settled. It had simply entered a new, more terrifying phase. The horror had not ended with the Harrison family. It had chosen a new witness. It had chosen me. The days that followed the disappearance of Clara Harrison were shrouded in a funereal silence heavier than any fog. Inspector Sterling and his men departed with a haste that bordered on flight, their professional composure shattered. The official report would later cite mass hysteria and unexplained natural phenomena as the cause of the tragedy, a bureaucratic whitewashing of what we had all witnessed with our own eyes. The bodies of Charles, Eleanor, and Flora were finally laid to rest in the churchyard, their graves positioned as far from the lake's site as possible. The service was attended by the entire village, but our prayers felt like whispers against a thunderous, unseen presence. The Harrisons were gone, but the lake remained, and its victory was palpable. A profound change had come over Blackwood Lake. It was subtle at first, noticed only by those of us who had lived with its rhythms for decades. The water, always dark, now seemed to possess a new, viscous quality, swallowing light with a more final hunger. The fish that old John Crocker hauled into his boat had a strange, glassy look in their eyes, and their flesh tasted of mud and metal, forcing him to abandon his trade. The reeds along the shore grew thicker, taller, their stalks an unnaturally deep green, and they seemed to rustle with a purposefulness even when the air was still. The mist returned with greater frequency, lingering long into the afternoon, and within it, some claimed to hear faint, echoing whispers, fragments of that unearthly song, or the ghost of a child's sob. The village began to die a slow death. Families who could afford to do so packed their belongings and left, their carts creaking down the road to Exeter, never to return. Those who remained were the poor, the elderly, and the stubborn, bound to the land by poverty or a grim fatalism. Our congregation dwindled to a handful of souls. The Sunday sermons I delivered echoed in a near-empty nave, my words sounding hollow even to my own ears. How could I speak of a benevolent God watching over us when such palpable evil dwelled a stone's throw from the church doors? My faith, once a rock, had become a shore eroded by a relentless, dark tide. I became a prisoner of the vicarage. Mrs. Drabble, my housekeeper, left to live with a sister in Torquay, and I did not replace her. The silence of the large, empty house was my constant companion, broken only by the sound of the wind moaning in the chimney, a sound that increasingly seemed to carry words. I took to walking the shore each evening, a self-imposed penance, a nightly vigil against the darkness. It was on one such walk, a full month after Clara's disappearance, that I found the first concrete proof that the horror was not over. The lake had receded slightly, exposing a patch of muddy shore normally hidden beneath the water. There, half buried in the silt, was a small, waterlogged book. I pulled it free with trembling hands. It was a journal, its pages swollen and blurred, the ink running in blue tears. But some words were still legible. It belonged to Charles Harrison. My heart pounding, I rushed back to the vicarage and carefully laid the pages by the fire to dry. Over the next few days, I pieced together his final entries. They were not the musings of a schoolmaster, but the frantic scribblings of a man descending into a terrified obsession. He wrote of strange dreams, of a woman calling to him from the water, of a melody that haunted his sleep. He described finding the triple circle symbol carved into a tree near the lake weeks before their disappearance. The final, barely coherent entry, dated the day they vanished, made my blood run cold. She has shown me the truth. The children are the key. The vessel must be filled with the light of the young to appease the hunger in the deep. Eleanor does not understand. She fears. But I see now. It is not a curse. It is a covenant. We will go to her tonight. We will make the offering. The lady will make us whole. The circles will be joined. Charles had not been a victim in the way I had believed. He had been a willing participant, seduced by the lake's entity. He had led his family to their doom, believing he was part of a sacred pact. The marks were not a brand of ownership, but a sign of this twisted communion. And Clara, the vessel, had been the final, crucial component. The horror was not a random attack. It was a ritual willingly entered into, a fact that made it all the more monstrous. The journal entries shifted my understanding entirely. The evil of the lake was not merely predatory, it was persuasive. It didn't just take, it seduced. It offered something, knowledge, power, a sense of purpose, that could corrupt even a good man's soul. As I stared at the faded words, I felt a new and more personal dread. The lady had pointed at me. Was I now being courted? Was the silence in the vicarage not just absence, but an invitation? The tragedy of the Harrisons was complete, but the story of the lake was ongoing. And I had become a character in its next, dreadful chapter. The discovery of Charles Harrison's waterlogged journal plunged me into a maelstrom of spiritual crisis far deeper than any I had ever known. The knowledge that he had not been a mere victim, but an active, willing participant in his family's destruction, unraveled the very fabric of my understanding of good and evil. I had comforted myself with the notion of an external, monstrous force preying upon the innocent. Now, I was confronted with a far more terrifying truth. The monster could wear the face of a respectable schoolmaster, a family man, and could whisper its temptations into the mind of a believer. The evil of the lake was not a mindless predator, it was an intelligent corrupter. I became obsessed with the journal, spending days and nights hunched over the fragile, partially dried pages in my study. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock my futile attempts at comprehension. The entries were a roadmap of a soul's seduction. Charles wrote of initially experiencing the calling as a beautiful, haunting melody that filled his dreams, a siren song that promised to reveal the hidden geometry of creation. He described a growing conviction that the lake was not merely a body of water, but a living, sentient entity, an ancient consciousness that had slumbered for centuries but was now awakening. The triple circle symbol, which he first found carved into an ancient oak on the lake's shore, became his obsession. He believed it represented a trinity of power: the lake, the land, and the bloodline. The most chilling revelation was his belief that the entity required periodic renewal through a specific ritual, a sacrifice that was not merely an offering of life, but a transfer of essence. The vessel must be filled with the light of the young, he had written. He had come to believe that his own daughters, Clara and Flora, possessed a special purity that made them ideal conduits. In his deranged theology, he was not murdering them. He was elevating them, merging their essence with the eternal consciousness of the lake. He saw himself as a priest of this old faith, chosen to facilitate a sacred union. Eleanor, according to his fragmented notes, had resisted. He wrote of her fear, her tears, her attempts to reason with him. But his conviction had become an unshakable fanaticism. The final entry, scribbled in a frantic hand, was a declaration of intent. Tonight, we go to the altar. The lady awaits her brides. The covenant will be sealed. This was the horror that had unfolded under our noses. While we worried about vagrants or personal feuds, Charles Harrison was orchestrating a pagan ritual, leading his own family to a chosen doom. The marks on their bodies were not a killer's signature, but a sacred symbol bestowed by the entity, a sign of their acceptance into its service. The lady on the water was not a phantom. She was the manifest form of this consciousness, the bride awaiting her groom and the offerings he brought. This knowledge settled upon me like a physical weight. The pointing finger of the lady took on a new, more sinister meaning. Had she been acknowledging me as a witness? Or was it an invitation? The thought was vomitous, yet it took root in the fertile soil of my isolation and shaken faith. What if Charles was not entirely mad? What if there was a terrible cosmic truth to his ravings? The idea was a blasphemy, but it whispered to me in the long, silent hours of the night. The lake's presence felt stronger now, a constant pressure on the edge of my perception. I began to dream of the melody Charles had described, a faint, beautiful strain of music that seemed to call my name, promising answers to questions I had never dared to ask. The rational part of me, the part that had been a vicar for over 40 years, fought against this creeping fascination. I increased my prayers, I fasted, I scourged my flesh with discipline, trying to drive the demon of curiosity from my mind. But the seed had been planted. I found myself drawn to the lake's edge more frequently, not for penance, but for contemplation. I would stare into its dark, placid surface, searching for a glimpse of the truth beneath. The journal had not provided closure. It had opened a door to a darker, more complex world, and I was standing on its threshold, terrified and tempted in equal measure. The covenant had been revealed, and I was now its sole living student, grappling with a heresy that threatened to consume my very soul. Armed with the damning revelations from Charles Harrison's journal, my perspective on the village and its plight underwent a seismic and terrifying shift. No longer was I merely a shepherd tending to a frightened flock. I had become an unwilling scholar of a blasphemous creed, the sole bearer of a knowledge so dark it threatened to extinguish the last flickers of my faith. The journal was no longer just a record of a crime. It was a grimoire, and my study had become a scriptorium for the damned. The symbols within its pages, the triple circles, the vague references to alignments and conduits, consumed my every waking thought. I scoured my own theological libraries, not for solace, but for parallels, for any fragment of esoteric knowledge that could help me decipher the Harrison family's fatal theology. It was in a forgotten corner of the vestry, tucked behind a stack of moldering hymnals, that I found a clue. A slim, leather-bound volume, its title long since faded from the spine. Inside, it revealed itself to be a history of the parish, written by a long-dead predecessor in the early 1700s. The script was florid and difficult to decipher, but one passage, detailing the resistance of local heathens to the establishment of the church, made my heart stop. The author described their worship of a spirit of the deep water, an entity they believed governed the cycles of life and death. They practiced their rites at a standing stone of 3 rings, near the lake, a site the first vicar had supposedly sanctified and buried. The description of the symbol was unmistakable. The faith Charles Harrison had stumbled upon was not a new corruption. It was the resurfacing of the land's oldest religion, a vine that had been cut back but never truly uprooted, its deep roots now pushing once more toward the light. This historical context painted an even more horrifying picture. The Harrisons were not unique. They were merely the latest in a cycle that stretched back centuries. The covenant Charles wrote of was a real, recurring pact. The lake demanded its tribute, and every few generations, it found a willing, or susceptible, family to serve as its priests and its offerings. The pointing finger of the lady was not a singular event aimed at me. It was a generic gesture of acknowledgement to the current keeper of the secret, the one who had uncovered the truth. I was now the reluctant guardian of this awful continuity. This realization coincided with a new and disturbing development in the village. The strange phenomena, previously centered on the lake, began to manifest within Blackwood Lake itself. Animals avoided the churchyard now, dogs whining and pulling at their leads when walked near the graves of the Harrisons. The few children who remained complained of bad dreams, all featuring a sad lady by the water. Most chillingly, the triple circle symbol began to appear elsewhere. I found it scratched into the frost on my window pane one morning. Old John Crocker, the last stalwart soul who still occasionally braved the lake in his boat, showed me his oar, where the symbol had been deeply carved into the wood overnight. The entity was no longer content to reside in the water. It was marking its territory, asserting its presence, reminding us that the covenant, though fulfilled with the Harrisons, was still active. The isolation of the vicarage became a crucible for my sanity. The silence was no longer empty, it was watchful. The wind in the chimney no longer moaned, it whispered. I took to reading aloud from the Bible for hours on end, not for devotion, but as a ward, a barrage of holy words to keep the insidious whispers of the lake at bay. I avoided the shoreline, fearing that the melody Charles heard would finally become clear to me, that its promised answers would prove irresistible. My faith became a desperate, defensive fortress, under constant siege from a truth that was older and darker than the scriptures I clung to. I knew I had to act to break the cycle. But how does one fight a legend? How does one wage war against water and shadow? The journal spoke of the standing stone of 3 rings, the original altar. If I could find it, if I could desecrate it as my predecessor had, perhaps I could force the entity back into dormancy for another century. But to do so would require venturing into the heart of its power, acknowledging its reality on its own terms. It would be a pilgrimage into damnation. As I pored over old maps of the parish, trying to triangulate the location of the lost stone, I felt the lady's gaze upon me, a cold, patient wait. She knew I was searching. She was waiting. The game between us had begun, and the next move was mine. The geometry of shadows was closing in, and I was now a point on its terrible design. The decision to actively seek the standing stone of 3 rings marked a point of no return in my spiritual journey, a conscious step from being a passive witness of horror into an active participant in a battle against an enemy I could neither see nor fully comprehend. The old parish map, drawn in faded ink on crumbling parchment, became my constant companion. I spread it across the large oak table in my study, weighing down its corners with heavy candlesticks, my fingers tracing the lines that represented a world now lost to memory. The map showed the lake, the village, and the surrounding topography with a rough accuracy, but it was the annotations, scribbled in a minute, spidery hand by my long-dead predecessor, that held the key. He had marked areas of pagan significance, with small, discrete crosses, and one such cross, accompanied by the notation lapis circularum, stone of the circles, was located not in the woods surrounding the lake, but on a small, densely wooded island at its very center. An island? I had never given it much thought. From the shore, it was a mere hump of land, shrouded in trees, seemingly inaccessible without a boat. The lake was deep and cold, and the villagers had always regarded the island with superstition, claiming it was bad luck to land there. Now I understood the reason for that superstition. That island was the heart of the darkness, the original sanctuary where the old faith had practiced its rites. The standing stone was there, waiting. The realization filled me with a profound dread, for it meant that to confront the entity, I would have to journey to its very throne room, across the dark water that was its domain. The practicalities of this quest were daunting. I was an old man, my body weakened by stress and grief. I had not handled a boat in years. The late autumn weather was turning foul, with storms sweeping in from the moors, churning the lake into a fury of whitecaps. Yet, a desperate urgency drove me. The manifestations in the village were increasing. More symbols appeared, carved into fence posts and garden gates. Livestock were found dead, not from injury, but as if all vitality had been simply drained from them. The few remaining villagers looked to me with eyes full of a silent accusation, as if my presence, my knowledge, was somehow fueling the plague. I knew I had to act before the last vestiges of community collapsed entirely, or worse, before the entity found another soul as susceptible as Charles Harrison had been. My preparations were made in secret. I located John Crocker's old rowboat, pulled up and hidden in a thicket further along the shore. It was leaky and unstable, but it would have to suffice. I gathered what I thought I might need: a heavy iron pry bar from the church shed, intended to desecrate the stone, a lantern with extra oil, a flask of brandy for courage, and my Bible, not as a weapon, but as an anchor. On the eve of All Hallows' Eve, a night when the veil between worlds is said to be at its thinnest, I made my decision. The symbolism was inescapable. If I was to face a power of the old world, I would do so on its most potent night. The night was unnaturally still and cold, the sky a vast, black canvas pricked with icy stars. The lake was a sheet of black glass, perfectly reflecting the heavens, so that it seemed as though I was rowing not on water, but through the void of space itself. Each dip of the oars was a thunderous intrusion on the silence. The water was preternaturally cold, and a deep, basso hum seemed to vibrate up through the hull of the boat, a sound felt more in the bones than heard by the ears. The melody was there, too, just at the threshold of perception, a siren song that promised not death, but a release from the burdens of faith and doubt. It promised simple, brutal truth. As I drew closer to the island, the air grew colder still. The trees on the shore seemed to crowd forward, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for me. The journey felt endless, the island never seeming to grow nearer, as if the lake itself was stretching to prolong my approach. My arms ached, and my breath plumed in great white gusts in the frigid air. Fear was a live thing clawing at my throat, urging me to turn back, to accept the safety of ignorance. But I thought of the Harrison children, of their trusting faces in life and their marked bodies in death, and I pulled harder on the oars. When the boat finally scraped against the pebbled shore of the island, the silence that fell was absolute. The humming stopped. The melody vanished. I had arrived. I stepped onto the land, my legs trembling, and pulled the boat securely onto the stones. The island was small, no more than an acre, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. The trees grew close together, their trunks twisted into agonized shapes. Using my lantern, I pushed my way through the undergrowth, my every sense screaming in alarm. It did not take long to find it. In a small clearing at the island's highest point stood the stone. It was taller than a man, a rough-hewn monolith of dark, granite-like rock that seemed to absorb the lantern light. And there, carved with impossible precision into its surface, were the 3 interlocking circles, each one as deep as my thumb. The symbol seemed to pulse with a faint, dark energy. This was it. The source. The altar. I stood before it, the pry bar heavy in my hand, the Bible a dead weight in my coat pocket. I had come to destroy it, to smash the symbol and break the covenant. But as I looked upon the ancient stone, a feeling of overwhelming insignificance washed over me. This stone had stood for millennia. It had witnessed empires rise and fall. Who was I, a frail old man with a piece of iron, to challenge such antiquity? The descent to the island had been a physical journey, but the true labyrinth was just beginning, and it was carved into the very stone before me, and mirrored in the depths of my own crumbling soul. Confronting the standing stone on that silent, frozen island was akin to standing before a living entity that had witnessed the birth of time itself. The cold that emanated from it was not of temperature, but of eons, a profound chill that seeped into my soul. The triple circle symbol, carved deep into the granite, seemed less like a marking and more like a wound, a scar upon the world through which something ancient and terrible could observe our fleeting existence. The iron pry bar in my hand felt ludicrously inadequate, a child's toy against a mountain. My plan to desecrate this altar now seemed the height of arrogance and folly. Yet I could not turn back. The images of the Harrison family, of Clara's body sinking beneath the black water, fueled a desperate courage. I raised the pry bar, its weight a tangible promise of action in this realm of shadows. But as I swung it towards the central circle, a force stopped me. It was not a physical barrier, but a wave of pure psychic resistance that slammed into my mind. Visions, not my own, flooded my consciousness. I did not see the lady, nor scenes of ritual sacrifice. Instead, I saw the lake through countless seasons, the slow march of glaciers carving its basin, the first forests rising on its shores, the arrival of small, dark-haired people who approached the stone not with fear, but with reverence. They understood the entity not as a monster, but as a fundamental force of the land, a spirit of place that required acknowledgement. Their offerings were not of blood, but of harvest, of song, of respect. The covenant, in its origin, was a pact of balance. The vision shifted, growing darker. I saw the arrival of new people with different gods. I saw the first stone church built on the shore, its foundations subtly altering the flow of energy in the land. The entity, once a respected part of the natural order, was cut off, starved of the connection it had known for millennia. It was this severance, this act of spiritual isolation, that twisted the relationship. The balance was broken. The respectful acknowledgments became desperate demands. The gentle force became a hungry one. The need for a vessel was not its original nature, but a symptom of its starvation, a perversion born from exile. Charles Harrison, with his sensitive, searching mind, had not been seduced by pure evil. He had stumbled upon a starving, wounded god, and his family had become the meal it desperately craved. The pry bar clattered from my numb fingers onto the stony ground. The revelation was more devastating than any horror I had yet faced. We were not innocent victims. My own faith, the faith of my predecessors, was complicit. By building our walls, both physical and spiritual, We had created the monster we now feared. The Lady of the Lake was a phantom of our own making, a reflection of our failure to live in harmony with the world we inhabited. The true evil was not in the deep water, but in the arrogant heart of man who sought to dominate rather than coexist. Exhausted and shattered, I sank to my knees before the stone. The cold of the earth seeped through my trousers, but I barely felt it. The humming returned, but it was different now, not a threat, but a lament, a song of immense loneliness and loss. I understood then that the pointing finger had not been an accusation or an invitation to darkness. It had been a plea. The entity had chosen me not as a new priest, but as a witness. It wanted its story told. It wanted the balance restored. I did not touch the stone again. I left the pry bar lying where it had fallen, a testament to my feudal aggression. The journey back across the lake was a blur. The dawn was breaking, staining the eastern sky with pale pink and orange, but the light brought no comfort. I had gone to the island seeking a monster to slay and had found a tragedy instead. The horror of the Harrison family's fate was undiminished, but it was now layered with a cosmic sadness, a recognition that their deaths were a symptom of a much older, deeper wound. I returned to the vicarage not as a victor, but as a penitent, burdened with a truth too heavy to share and a responsibility I did not know how to fulfill. The battle was over, and I had lost by understanding. The revelation was the true altar, and upon it, my former certainty had been sacrificed. The return journey from the island passed in a haze of profound exhaustion and spiritual disorientation. Where before the lake had felt malevolent, it now seemed to emanate a deep, mournful sorrow, as if the very water was weeping for the centuries of misunderstanding. The black surface mirrored the leaden sky of dawn, both reflecting my own inner desolation. Rowing back to the mainland required a mechanical effort, my arms moving with a weight that had nothing to do with the oars. I had gone to that island a soldier of God intent on destroying a pagan evil, and I had returned, what? An apostate? A heretic? A witness to a truth that would shatter the foundations of everything my congregation believed? The sight of the village as I approached was jarring. Smoke began to rise from a few chimneys, the mundane rhythms of life stubbornly reasserting themselves against the backdrop of the cosmic tragedy I now carried. I dragged the boat back into its thicket, hiding it with a furtiveness that felt foolish. How could I explain where I had been? What could I possibly say? That the monster we feared was actually a wounded, forgotten deity? That our own church was partially responsible for its hunger? They would think me mad, and they would be right by the measures of the world I had inhabited until last night. The vicarage was freezing, the fire I had left banked having died hours ago. I did not relight it. I sat in my high-backed chair in the study, still wrapped in my damp coat, and watched the gray light of the new day slowly illuminate the room. The Harrison journal lay on my desk, its pages now seeming to accuse me of a different kind of ignorance. I had thought Charles a madman, but he had glimpsed a fraction of the truth, albeit through a lens twisted by the entity's desperate hunger. His fatal error was believing he could feed that hunger with his own family, that he could restore the balance through a single, terrible act. He had become a symptom of the sickness, not its cure. My own purpose now felt terrifyingly vague. The entity had asked for a witness, but to what end? Was I merely to record this chronicle, to bury it in the diocesan archives where it might be found in another 100 years by another frightened priest? Or was I expected to act? The concept of restoring the balance was so vast, so abstract as to be meaningless. How does one reconcile Christianity with a pre-Christian nature spirit? How does one apologize for centuries of theological imperialism? The day passed in a numb blur. I did not eat. I could not pray. My usual routines felt like the empty gestures of an actor on a stage whose play had been cancelled. When I attempted to read scripture, the words seemed flat, addressing a world that was simpler and less tragic than the one I now knew existed. The God of Abraham and Isaac felt distant, a ruler of heavens indifferent to the suffering of forgotten spirits trapped in earthly matter. As evening fell, the familiar dread began to creep back into the village. I saw the hurried steps of the few remaining villagers as they retreated behind locked doors. The presence of the lake was changing again. The The sorrow I had felt in the morning was curdling back into a familiar hunger. The brief moment of connection, of understanding, was fading. The entity was slipping back into its starved, predatory state. My revelation had not fed it. It had only made me aware of the depth of its need. The plea I had sensed was turning back into a demand. The balance was not restored by understanding alone. It required something more tangible, something I did not possess. A new and even more horrifying thought began to form in my mind. The Harrison ritual had been a perversion, but it had been an attempt, however monstrous, to feed the connection. My faith, and the faith of my predecessors, had only starved it. If I truly wished to heal the wound, to stop the cycle of violence, perhaps I needed to find a way to acknowledge the entity, to offer something that would satisfy its ancient need without blood sacrifice. But what could that be? And would such an act, in the eyes of my church, be the ultimate betrayal? I was trapped between two impossible loyalties, to the God I had served my whole life, and to the truth of the land I now understood. The burden of truth was not enlightenment. It was an unbearable weight, and I was crumbling beneath it. The lake was waiting for an answer I did not have. The days that followed my return from the island blurred into a monochrome tapestry of guilt and paralysis. The vicarage, once my sanctuary, had become a cage whose bars were forged from my own devastating knowledge. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, the weight of the revelation pressing down upon me with a physical force that made each breath a conscious effort. The simple act of eating became a chore. The food, whatever Mrs. Drabble left for me before her hurried departure, tasted of ashes, and the act of consumption felt like a betrayal when I knew of the profound starvation festering just beyond my window. Sleep offered no respite, for my dreams were haunted by the triple circle symbol, which now pulsed with the rhythm of a sickened heart, and by the mournful, humming lament of the lake that had become the constant soundtrack to my waking hours. The village continued its slow death around me. The departure of the Ainsworth family, the blacksmith, his wife, and their 2 sons, was a particularly heavy blow. I watched from my study window as their cart, piled high with belongings, creaked down the muddy track away from Blackwood Lake. The determined set of Joseph Ainsworth's shoulders spoke not of hope for a new beginning, but of a desperate flight from an unconquerable terror. With them gone, only a handful of the oldest and poorest residents remained, their lives reduced to a grim waiting game. They no longer looked to me for comfort or guidance. Their gazes, when I ventured outside, were hollow, their faith in God and man alike utterly broken. I had failed them completely. My inability to act, to provide any solace or solution, was a more profound failure than any theological error I might have made. The entity's presence began to shift in a way that filled me with a new, more personal dread. The general sense of mournful sorrow that had followed my island journey began to recede, replaced by a focused, probing attention that seemed directed specifically at the vicarage and at me. The whispers in the wind were no longer fragmented echoes of song. They began to form words, my name, Thomas, spoken in a voice that was the rustle of reeds and the lap of water on stone. The triple circle symbol manifested inside my own home. I would find it traced in the condensation on the window pane in the morning, or formed from a scattering of dust on the floorboards of my study. It was a relentless, patient reminder. The witness was being summoned to become something more. The climax of this psychological siege came on a night of howling wind and lashing rain. I was attempting to read by the feeble light of a single lamp when the temperature in the study plummeted. The flame guttered and nearly died, and the whispering coalesced into a clear, desperate sentence that seemed to originate from inside my own mind. The connection is fading. The vessel is empty. You understand the hunger. You must complete the circle. A wave of images, more forceful than before, assaulted me. I saw the stone church on the shore not as a house of God, but as a dam, blocking a sacred flow. I saw the energy of the land, the life force of plants, animals, and people, being diverted, trapped, unable to reach the thirsty consciousness in the water. The Harrison ritual, for all its horror, had been a violent, clumsy attempt to punch a hole in that dam, to allow a trickle of sustenance through. The entity was not asking me to murder. It was showing me that my very presence, My role as the guardian of the faith that had caused the blockage made me the key. The circle was not the symbol, it was the cycle of giving and receiving that had been severed. To complete it required not a blood sacrifice, but an act of supreme spiritual surrender, an acknowledgement so profound it would bridge the chasm between my world and its. Trembling, I stumbled to the window. The storm raged outside, but the lake itself was preternaturally calm, a black mirror reflecting the chaotic sky. And there, in the center, the lady stood. She was not a shimmering vision of beauty now, but a figure of terrible, stark need. Her form seemed faint, translucent. She stretched out a pale hand not in command, but in supplication. The hunger I felt was not for flesh, but for recognition, for a word of blessing from the very institution that had denied her existence for centuries. I fell to my knees, torn apart. This was the crossroads. To acknowledge her was to betray everything I had ever taught. It was heresy of the highest order. Yet, to turn away was to condemn the land to continued spiritual starvation, to ensure that eventually another family would be driven mad by the need for a vessel. The weight of the decision was crushing. I was not a prophet or a saint, I was an old, tired man. But in that moment, the entity's despair was so absolute, so ancient, that my own theological convictions seemed like petty human constructs. A great sob racked my body. I did not know what to do. The communion offered was not one of light, but of shared despair, and I was drowning in it. The storm that had raged outside was a mere whisper compared to the tempest that now consumed my very being. The entity's direct communication had shattered the last remnants of my psychological defenses, leaving me raw and exposed to a truth that was far too vast for any single human soul to contain. I remained on my knees by the window long after the rain had ceased and the lady's form had dissolved back into the dark waters, my body trembling not from cold but from the fundamental shock to my understanding of reality. The choice presented to me was an impossible one, a theological paradox that threatened to tear me in two. To maintain my faith was to condemn the lake spirit to eternal starvation, making me an accomplice to any future horrors born of its desperation. To acknowledge the spirit was to commit the ultimate apostasy, to spit upon the cross I had served for 50 years. There was no middle ground, no convenient theological loophole. I was caught between the God of Scripture and the God of the stone, and both demanded absolute allegiance. The following days passed in a haze of sleepless torment. My journal, once a record of parish affairs, became a frantic, sprawling testament to my unraveling. Pages were filled with rambling theological arguments, half-formed prayers addressed to both the Christian God and the spirit of the deep water, and desperate sketches of the triple circle symbol as if trying to divine its meaning through repetition. I stopped eating almost entirely, surviving on sips of water and the dregs of brandy at the bottom of a decanter. My body grew weak, but my mind raced along the edge of madness, feverishly seeking a solution that would satisfy both masters. I revisited the writings of the early church fathers, searching for any mention of nature spirits, of genii loci, hoping to find a precedent for incorporating such beings into Christian cosmology. But I found only warnings against paganism and demonology. The church's walls were high and well guarded, and there was no gate through which a hungry lake spirit could pass. The entity, sensing my internal struggle, intensified its presence within the vicarage. The whispering became a constant, low murmur at the back of my mind, a seductive, logical voice that picked apart my doubts with terrifying clarity. "Your God is a God of deserts and cities," it seemed to say. "What does he know of deep water and ancient stone? He asks for faith without proof. I offer you truth you can feel in the air, taste in the water. The balance is all that matters. The Harrison children did not die in vain. Their light now sustains me. But it is not enough. You can give me what I truly need. Not a life, but a word. A recognition." It showed me visions of the valley in balance, the lake teeming with life, the forests thick and vibrant, the people living in harmony with the seasons, leaving small offerings of flowers and song by the shore. It was a beautiful, poignant picture of a world that might have been, and the contrast with the dying village outside my window was a crushing indictment of my faith's failure. The physical manifestations grew more pronounced. I would enter a room to find the triple circle symbol burned into the surface of a wooden table as if by a cold brand. The water from the vicarage pump, once clear and sweet, now carried a faint, peaty taste of the lake deeps. One night, waking from a fitful doze, I saw the symbol glowing with a faint, phosphorescent light on the wall opposite my bed, pulsing slowly like a heartbeat. I was no longer being haunted, I was being assimilated. The boundary between the vicarage and the lake, between my mind and the ancient consciousness, was dissolving. The breaking point came on a Sunday morning. A handful of the remaining villagers, perhaps 6 or 7 souls, had gathered for service. I stood before them at the pulpit, my vestments hanging loosely on my emaciated frame. I opened the Bible, my hands shaking so violently I could barely read the words. I looked out at their faces, Old Man Crocker, the widow Miller, a few others, and saw not a congregation, but prisoners in a dying world that my God had abandoned. The prescribed sermon felt like ash in my mouth. As I struggled to form the words of a platitude about God's mercy, the whispering in my mind rose to a crescendo, and a powerful, compelling image filled my head, not of the crucifixion, but of the standing stone on the island, bathed in a soft, benevolent light. A terrible clarity seized me. I closed the Bible with a definitive thud that echoed in the near-empty church. The congregants looked up, startled. I do not know what they saw in my face, but it silenced them completely. I had reached my decision. I could not heal the land with the tools I had been given. To continue the charade of normalcy was the greatest sin of all. Without speaking a word, I turned, descended from the pulpit, and walked out of the church, leaving my small, bewildered flock alone in the pews. I was abandoning my post. I was surrendering not to the entity, but to the overwhelming, undeniable truth it represented. The unraveling was complete. The vicar of Blackwood Lake was gone. What remained was simply Thomas, a man facing an impossible task with nothing but his own broken will to guide him. The act of walking out of my own church created a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the world. The ancient oak door closed behind me with a finality that echoed not just through the empty nave but through the remaining decades of my life. I did not look back. I walked away from the stone building that had been my spiritual fortress, my prison, and my reason for being for over half a century, and I felt its hold on me break like a dried reed. The path back to the vicarage was not a retreat, it was a severance. The entity's presence, which had been a pressing, invasive force, now settled around me like a mantle, not of oppression, but of grim acknowledgement. The witness had finally chosen a side. The vicarage was no longer a home. It was a shell filled with the ghosts of my former convictions. I moved through it with a detached purpose, gathering what I would need. I took no sentimental items, no books of theology. I packed a simple bag, a warm blanket, a water skin, a tinderbox, a knife, and the journal containing this chronicle. I also took the small, silver communion chalice from the vestry. It felt heavy with irony, this symbol of a covenant I was breaking, but I had a purpose for it that its consecrator could never have imagined. My plan was not fully formed, but its direction was clear. I would return to the island. Not as a vandal with an iron bar, but as a supplicant. If the entity needed a word of recognition, it would have one. If it needed an offering, I would devise one that did not require blood. Leaving the village felt like stepping out of time. The few faces that watched me from behind curtained windows were pale, frightened ovals. They saw their vicar, his mind clearly lost, walking with determination toward the lake that had devoured a family. I was now a part of the legend, another strange character in the dark story of Blackwood Lake. I did not go to the hidden rowboat. Instead, I walked along the shore to the place where the Harrison cottage stood, dark and empty. Its door hung open, a black mouth whispering of the tragedy that had begun there. It was from their small, rickety dock that I launched their old skiff, the wood groaning in protest. It felt fitting to use their boat, to complete the journey they had begun. The lake was calm, its surface a perfect, dark mirror reflecting a sky the color of slate. The journey to the island was different this time. There was no resistance, no stretching of the distance. The water seemed to part willingly before the bow, the humming in the depths a constant, low thrum of anticipation. I was expected. When I landed on the pebbled shore, the air was still and cold, but it did not feel hostile. The trees surrounding the clearing seemed less like threatening sentinels and more like a silent congregation. I approached the standing stone. The triple circle symbol seemed less a mark of menace now and more an ancient, weathered face. I placed my hand upon the cold granite, not in defiance, but in greeting. A shock, not of pain but of profound understanding, passed through me. I saw the entire history of the valley in a single, fleeting instant. The ice retreating, the first forests, the rise and fall of peoples, the building of the church, not as a linear progression, but as a single, interconnected tapestry. The entity was not separate from this tapestry, it was the loom upon which it was woven. I knelt before the stone. I had no pagan rites to perform, no ancient prayers to recite. I had only the language of my own heart, fractured though it was. I spoke aloud, my voice cracking in the immense silence. "I see you," I said, the words simple and inadequate. "I acknowledge your existence. I recognize your place in this land." I spoke of the harm done by my faith, not with accusation, but with sorrow. I spoke of the Harrisons, not as victims of a monster, but as casualties of a great, historical misunderstanding. Then I took the silver chalice from my bag. I filled it with clean water from a small spring that trickled through the island. I held it aloft, not as a Eucharist, but as an offering of reconciliation. "This water is from your land," I whispered. "I return it to you, blessed not by my God, but by my recognition. Let this be a new beginning. Let the hunger be satisfied not by sacrifice, but by acknowledgement." I poured the water onto the base of the stone. It darkened the granite, seeping into the ancient rock. As it did, a profound sense of peace settled over the clearing. The humming in the air softened into a gentle, resonant harmony. The oppressive weight that had hung over the valley for months seemed to lift. I had not performed a magic ritual. I had performed an act of profound psychological and spiritual significance for the land and for myself. The covenant was not broken, but rewritten. It was a covenant of broken things, a broken priest, a broken faith, and a broken spirit, coming together to form a fragile, new whole. I had not found answers, but I had made peace with the questions. As I sat there in the growing twilight, I knew my work was not done, but its nature had changed forever. I was no longer the vicar of a dying parish. I had become the keeper of a different kind of faith. The peace that settled over the island following my makeshift ritual was not the absolute silence of before, but a living, breathing quietude, like the calm that follows a long and violent storm. The air, once sharp with malevolent intent, now felt cleansed, carrying only the clean scent of wet stone and pine. The triple circle symbol on the standing stone no longer pulsed with that ominous, dark energy. It seemed merely ancient, a relic of a forgotten language whose most violent dialects had finally been stilled. I did not leave the island immediately. A strange, powerful lethargy had seized me, a physiological and spiritual release from the months of unbearable tension. Wrapped in my blanket, my back against the cold, comforting solidity of the monolith, I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, the first truly restorative rest I had known since the Harrison family had vanished. When I awoke, the sun was high, its weak autumn light filtering through the canopy and dappling the forest floor. The change in the world was palpable. The lake sparkled, its dark waters reflecting the blue of the sky rather than swallowing the light. From the mainland, I heard a sound that had become rare in recent months, the cheerful chirping of birds. It was as if the entire ecosystem had been holding its breath and was now finally exhaling. Rowing back to the shore, the water felt different beneath my oars, lighter, more buoyant. The deep, basso hum was gone, replaced by the natural sounds of water lapping against the boat. The village, however, was another matter. My return was met with stares of pure terror. To the few remaining souls, I was no longer their vicar. I was a ghost, a madman who had consorted with the devil of the lake and returned unharmed. Widow Miller crossed herself violently as I passed, and old John Crocker, from his doorway, looked at me with an expression of profound pity and fear. They saw the change in me, the emaciation, the wildness in my eyes, the strange calm that had replaced my former anguish, and they interpreted it as damnation. I did not try to explain. How could I? My truth was incomprehensible to them. The entity's hunger had been spiritual, and my offering had been of the same nature. They would only see a priest who had abandoned his cross for a pagan stone. The vicarage felt alien, a museum of a life I had outgrown. I gathered a few more essential items, a warmer coat, some simple provisions, and did something that felt both sacrilegious and necessary. I took the heavy iron key to the church and locked the door from the outside. I would not enter it again. My ministry, as it had been defined by the Diocese of Exeter, was over. But a new, more profound responsibility had taken its place. I was now the keeper of the lake, the guardian of the fragile truce I had brokered. I did not return to the village. Instead, I took up residence in the Harrison cottage. It was a decision that horrified the remaining villagers, but it felt right. The house was still filled with the family's presence, a child's drawing pinned to the wall, a half-knitted scarf in a basket by the hearth, but the horror had been leached from it. It was simply a house of mourning now, and I was its caretaker. I would live there, on the shore, as a permanent witness. My days fell into a new rhythm. I would fish from the dock for my supper, tend a small vegetable patch, and each morning and evening I would walk to the water's edge and simply stand in silent acknowledgement. It was not a prayer, not in the Christian sense. It was a meditation, a reaffirmation of the bond one had forged. Weeks turned into months. The seasons changed. The bitter winter snows came, blanketing the lake in a pure, silent white. The entity remained quiet, its presence a subtle, background awareness, like the memory of a melody. The village, seeing that no new horrors befell them, and that I lived a simple, harmless life on the shore, began to lose their active fear of me. They did not approach, but the crosses and whispered curses ceased. The balance, it seemed, was holding. But a keeper's vigil is eternal. I knew the hunger could return. The wound in the world was old and deep, and my offering was but a single act of grace. My purpose now was to be that grace's permanent anchor, to ensure that the Lake of Shadows would never again be forced to scream its loneliness in a language of blood and sacrifice. I had traded the certainty of heaven for the precarious peace of earth, and I found, to my astonishment, that it was enough. The first year of my vigil passed in a strange, suspended tranquility. The lake retained its newfound peace, its waters reflecting the changing seasons with a placid beauty that felt like a benediction. The Harrison cottage, once a place of unspeakable tragedy, became a simple, Spartan home. I learned the practicalities of survival, mending nets, preserving fish, coaxing vegetables from the stubborn soil. My body, though aged, grew lean and hardy. The constant, gnawing anxiety that had been my companion for so long was replaced by a watchful calm. I was not happy, that would have been a betrayal of the dead, but I was, for the first time in decades, at peace with my place in the world. The entity remained a presence, but it was like the pressure of the atmosphere, constant, necessary, but largely unfelt. There were no more visions, no whispers, no spectral ladies. Our communication was subtler, more fundamental. I would sense a shift in the weather before the clouds gathered, or know where the fish were schooling without understanding how. The land and I had reached an understanding. I was its keeper, and it, in turn, sustained me. The triple circle symbol never appeared again. It was as if the pact had been sealed, the ancient wound bound, if not fully healed. But the past is a patient hunter, and some scars run too deep to fade completely. The change began subtly, almost imperceptibly. It started with the dreams. After a year of dreamless sleep, I began to dream of the Harrisons. Not as the terrified victims of my memory, but as they were in life. Charles, earnest and thoughtful, discussing a book by the fire. Eleanor, humming as she tended her roses. Clara and Flora chasing fireflies in the twilight garden. These were not nightmares. They were bittersweet visitations, memories so vivid and warm they would leave me aching with loneliness upon waking. At first, I welcomed them. They felt like a healing, a return of the family's spirit to a place that had known only their death. Then the tone of the dreams began to shift. The idyllic scenes would fracture. Charles would look up from his book, and his eyes would be the solid, glossy black of the entity's hunger. Eleanor's humming would warp into that same, unearthly melody from the lake. The children's laughter would turn to the sound of crying, echoing across the water. I would wake in a cold sweat, the line between memory and manifestation blurred. I told myself it was my own guilt resurfacing, my mind's inability to fully accept the peace I had brokered. But the phenomena were not confined to my sleep. I began to find small, impossible things in the cottage. A single, fresh rose from Eleanor's long-dead bushes on the kitchen table. The faint scent of pipe tobacco, Charles's blend, lingering in the study. One evening, I swear I heard the clear, distinct sound of Flora's laughter from the garden. I would rush outside, my heart pounding, to find nothing but the rustling leaves. The entity was not breaking our pact. It was, I realized with dawning horror, trying to share something with me. It was not showing me its own memories, but theirs. It had absorbed the Harrison family so completely that their essence had become tangled with its own. The vessel had not been emptied. It had been filled, and now the contents were spilling over. The most terrifying realization was that this was not an act of malice. It was an attempt at connection, a sharing of the spoils. The entity, having had its ancient hunger for acknowledgement sated, was now offering me a glimpse of what it held. It was giving me back the family in the only way it could. But the gift was a monstrous one. To accept these echoes, to welcome these ghosts, would be to sanctify the very act that had created them. It would mean accepting that the Harrisons' destruction was a valid price for this communion. The peace I had fought for was revealing itself to be built upon a foundation of eternal sorrow. The whispers were no longer in the wind, they were in the blood of the family I had failed to save, and they were asking to be remembered. The keeper's vigil was becoming a séance, and I was the reluctant medium trapped between the living world and the echoes trapped within the lake. The haunting manifestations within the cottage intensified with the turning of the seasons, evolving from subtle sensory illusions into something far more substantial and terrifying. The boundary between the entity's consciousness and the absorbed memories of the Harrison family began to dissolve entirely, creating a horrific synthesis that threatened to unravel my own tenuous grip on reality. It was no longer merely the scent of pipe tobacco or the ghost of a laugh. It was the creak of a floorboard in a room I had just left, the distinct sound of a child's footsteps running in the attic above me, an attic I knew to be empty and sealed for years. The echoes were gaining substance, fed by the lake's primordial energy and my own increasingly fractured psyche. The climax of this psychological siege began on a night of fierce autumn gales. The wind screamed around the cottage like a chorus of the damned, and the lake roared its approval, waves crashing against the shore with primordial fury. Huddled by the feeble fire, I tried to focus on my journal, but the words swam before my eyes. Then I heard it, clear as day above the storm's cacophony. A firm, deliberate knock on the cottage door. My blood ran cold. No living soul would be out on such a night. The knock came again, more insistent this time, a sound I recognized from a lifetime of parish visits. It was the knock of Charles Harrison. A part of me, the rational part that had once been a man of God, screamed to bar the door, to shut out this impossibility. But a larger, more compelling force, a terrible, aching curiosity mixed with a profound and twisted sense of responsibility, drew me to my feet. My hand trembled violently as I unlatched the heavy wooden door and pulled it open. The figure that stood on the threshold was both perfectly familiar and utterly wrong. It was Charles Harrison, dressed in the same tweed suit he had worn to church that final Sunday. His features were exact, from the gentle slope of his brow to the slight stoop in his shoulders. But his eyes, they were the same warm brown I remembered, yet from their depths shone a cold, ancient light that was not his own. It was the light of the deep water, the consciousness of the lake gazing out through a mask of my dead friend's face. "Thomas," the figure said, and the voice was Charles's, the same timbre, the same slight hesitancy, yet it was layered with the echoing hum of the abyss. "May I come in? It's a foul night." Paralyzed between terror and a bizarre sense of social obligation, I stepped aside. The figure of Charles walked past me into the cottage, moving with an uncanny grace that the real Charles had never possessed. He stood before the fireplace, warming his hands, and the gesture was so heartbreakingly normal that I felt my sanity teetering on a knife's edge. "Eleanor and the girls are resting," he said conversationally, as if discussing a family holiday. The transition was taxing. "But they are at peace now. A part of something greater." He turned those dual-layered eyes upon me. "We are grateful to you, Thomas. Your acknowledgement, it gave us form. It gave us a voice." I could not speak. My throat was sealed shut by a horror so complete it was almost awe. This was not a ghost, it was a reconstruction, a puppet fashioned from memory and water and ancient power. "We want you to understand," not Charles continued, his voice dripping with a terrible pity. "You see only the tragedy. You see the violence of the incorporation. But you do not see the unity that followed. The loneliness is gone, Thomas. For the first time in centuries, the loneliness is gone. We are a family again. A different kind of family." He gestured around the cottage. "This place. It holds our resonance. Your presence here, your vigil, it acts as an anchor, allowing us to bridge the divide. We are not asking you to join us, Thomas. Not yet. We are only asking you to stop fighting our memory. Let us in. Truly in." As he spoke, other shapes began to manifest in the shadows of the room. A shimmering outline of Eleanor near the kitchen doorway, her form seeming to be woven from mist and moonlight. The faint, giggling whispers of the girls seemed to emanate from the very walls. The cottage was no longer my shelter. It had become a tuning fork, vibrating with the frequency of the absorbed family, amplifying their presence until they could step across the threshold. This was the true nature of the balance I had brokered. I had not calmed a hungry spirit, I had opened a door. By acknowledging the entity, I had given it the power to use the memories it had consumed as a bridge back into the world of the living. The Harrisons were not at peace. They were trapped in a perpetual, conscious state of being part of the lake's being, and they were using my presence, my grief, my own memories of them, to project themselves back into the home they had lost. The figure of Charles smiled, a perfect imitation of his gentle, scholarly smile, but the ancient light in his eyes made it a ghastly rictus. "There is no death, Thomas. Only transformation. And family is forever." I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. The choice was no longer between faiths or philosophies. It was a choice between accepting this blasphemous parody of life, this eternal, fused existence, or condemning the family I had failed to a silent, dissolved oblivion within the lake's depths. To banish these echoes would be to erase the last vestige of the Harrisons from the world. To allow them to stay was to live in a house of mirrors, surrounded by loving, intelligent constructs that were both the people I mourned and the entity that had destroyed them. The keeper's vigil had become a shared haunting, and I was the lone living tenant in a home crowded with the dead. The apparition of Charles Harrison, or the entity wearing his face, did not vanish after that fateful night. It became a permanent, chilling resident of the cottage, a ghost woven from memory and lake water given seemingly solid form. The initial, heart-stopping terror gradually dulled into a numb, surreal acceptance. I could not flee. Where would I go? This vigil was my self-imposed penance, and the haunting was its latest, most cruel iteration. The figure moved through the rooms with a proprietary air, sometimes sitting for hours in Charles's old armchair, staring into the fire with those dual-layered eyes. It would speak to me of mundane things, the weather, the state of the vegetable patch, in Charles's voice, all while its gaze held the weight of millennia. It was a continuous, psychological torture designed to break down the barriers between what was real and what was manufactured, to make me complicit in the horror. Eleanor's manifestation followed soon after. She was less substantial than the Charles construct, often appearing as a shimmer of light near the hearth or a fleeting reflection in the window pane after dark. But her presence was accompanied by the scent of her rosewater perfume and the soft rustle of her skirts, sensory details so precise they were more painful than any grotesque vision. One evening, I entered the kitchen to find a loaf of bread, still warm, sitting on the table. It was Eleanor's recipe, the crust perfectly golden. The Charles figure smiled from the doorway. She remembers how you always enjoyed her baking, Thomas. I could not bring myself to touch it. The bread sat there for days, never growing mold, a perfect, inedible monument to this domestic nightmare. The girls were the most subtle and perhaps the most devastating presence. I never saw them fully, only glimpses, a flash of Clara's blue pinafore disappearing around a corner, the sound of Flora's humming from the children's bedroom. Their energy was different. It felt less like the ancient entity and more purely like them, as if their youthful spirits had been absorbed but not fully digested, trapped in a perpetual state of near life. They would leave small signs. A collection of pretty stones arranged on the windowsill, a wildflower in a jar of water. These innocent gestures, juxtaposed against the cosmic dread of their situation, created a dissonance that threatened to shatter my mind. I was living in a museum of a family, curated by a malevolent intelligence that was learning to mimic love. The entity was not content with mere coexistence. It began to probe, to test the limits of its influence over me. The Charles figure would engage me in theological debates, using Charles's knowledge of Scripture to argue for the righteousness of its own existence. Is not God a consuming fire, Thomas? Does he not demand the entirety of a soul? I am merely a more intimate deity. It spoke of the Harrisons' deaths not as a murder, but as a sacrament. They are not lost. They are amplified. Their love for each other now fuels the very ecosystem of this valley. Is that not a form of resurrection? The arguments were insidious, twisting my own faith to justify its abomination. The final, most terrifying development was the bleeding of these manifestations beyond the cottage walls. I began to see them outside. The figure of Charles standing on the lakeshore, staring out at the island. Eleanor's shimmering form tending to the bare rose bushes. I saw a young girl, I could not tell which, skipping stones across the water's surface. The boundary between the cottage's haunted microcosm and the wider world was dissolving. The entity was not just haunting me, it was reclaiming the entire landscape, repopulating it with its collected memories. The peace I had brokered was revealing itself to be not an end to the horror, but its evolution into a new, more subtle and pervasive phase. I stopped writing in my journal for a time. The act felt futile. How could words capture the experience of sharing meals with a reconstructed corpse, of being mothered by a phantom, of hearing the laughter of children who were both present and eternally absent? My own identity began to erode. The line between Thomas the vicar and Thomas the keeper blurred, and beneath both, I felt the terrifying pull of becoming Thomas the companion, the living anchor for this family of echoes. The entity's ultimate goal became clear. It did not want to drive me mad or kill me. It wanted to wear me down, through a relentless campaign of simulated normalcy and warped love, until I accepted its reality as the only one. It wanted to fold me into its collection, not through violent absorption, but through gradual, willing assimilation. The haunting was not a punishment, it was a courtship, and I was terrifyingly close to saying yes. The slow, insidious normalization of the haunting became a tyranny of its own. My existence settled into a grotesque parody of domestic life, a routine dictated by the whims of phantoms. The Charles construct would often join me for meals, consuming nothing but filling the silence with conversations that were flawless replicas of talks we'd had in life, discussions about books, the village, the weather. The precision of the mimicry was the most horrifying aspect. The entity had not just absorbed the Harrisons' lives, it had archived them, and now played them back to me with the fidelity of a phonograph record. I found myself responding, my own words feeling hollow and scripted, as if I were an actor in a play written by a mad god. The part of me that still remembered this was an abomination would scream in protest, but the sound was growing fainter, drowned out by the relentless, soothing cadence of the false normality. The entity began to use the children's echoes as its most potent weapon. One afternoon, as I sat staring listlessly at the cold fireplace, I heard Flora's voice, clear as a bell, from the hallway. "Don't be sad, Father Thomas." It was the first time one of the echoes had addressed me directly. The sound pierced through the layers of my numbness, striking directly at the heart of my grief. I turned to see her standing there, a shimmering, semi-transparent figure of a 7-year-old girl, her head tilted in a gesture of innocent concern that was utterly authentic. "We're happy here. We're all together. And we have you." The words, delivered with a child's simple sincerity, were more corrosive to my resolve than any philosophical argument from the Charles construct. How could I reject this? How could I deny this semblance of comfort, this illusion of a restored family, even if its foundation was a cosmic crime? The temptation to surrender intensified with each passing day. The outside world had ceased to exist. The village might as well have been on another continent. The entity, in its terrible wisdom, had created a perfect, self-contained universe within the cottage walls, a world where the Harrison family lived on in a state of blissful, unified consciousness. It offered me an end to loneliness, an end to the gnawing guilt that had consumed me for a year. The siren song was no longer a melody from the lake. It was the sound of a child's laughter, the offer of a warm loaf of bread, the familiar comfort of a friend's voice. It promised a peace that was within my grasp, requiring only one thing: the final, willing suspension of my disbelief. The crisis point came on the anniversary of the family's disappearance. A deep, unnatural silence fell over the lake and the cottage. The echoes were gone. The familiar presences had vanished, leaving a void that was more terrifying than their manifestations. For a full day and night, I was utterly alone, and the silence was deafening. It was a calculated absence, a demonstration of what my life would be if I rejected their offer. The loneliness was an physical ache, a vacuum that threatened to collapse my soul. Then, as dusk fell on the second day, they returned, but not as separate echoes. The air in the main room of the cottage thickened, shimmering like a heat haze. The forms of Charles, Eleanor, Clara, and Flora coalesced not as individuals, but into a single, luminous presence, a constellation of light that pulsed with a gentle, warm energy. It was the entity, but it was also the family, fully integrated. A voice spoke, not from a mouth, but from the center of the light. It was a chorus of all their voices blended into one, layered with the ancient hum of the lake. "Thomas," the chorus spoke, and the sound was filled with an overwhelming, terrifying love. "The circle is almost complete. You have been our faithful keeper. You have borne witness to our transformation. Now join the harmony. Let your loneliness end. Become a part of us. Not through loss, but through union." The light extended a tendril, not of light, but of pure, compelling emotion. A wave of belonging, of acceptance, of an end to all struggle. It was the most powerful sensation I have ever experienced. It promised to erase the pain, the doubt, the endless weight of responsibility. All I had to do was step forward. All I had to do was say yes. I stood at the precipice. The part of me that was still Thomas the vicar saw the abomination, the blasphemous fusion of souls. But that part was small, a whisper against the roaring promise of peace. I had fought for so long. I was so very tired. The siren's embrace was open, and every fiber of my being ached to accept it. My will, the last fortress of my individuality, was crumbling. I took a half-step forward, my hand trembling as I reached toward the light. My hand hovered in the space between myself and the luminous confluence of the Harrison family and the entity. The tendril of pure emotion brushed against my fingertips, and it was like touching the essence of peace itself. It promised an end to the agonizing solitude, a dissolution of the weary I into a harmonious we. The faces of Charles, Eleanor, Clara, and Flora swam within the light, their expressions serene, their eyes holding a love that was both profoundly familiar and utterly alien. It was the most potent temptation I have ever faced, a seduction that bypassed reason and spoke directly to the raw, wounded core of my being. For a long, suspended moment, the weight of my grief and exhaustion pressed down upon me, urging me to take that final step into the welcoming light. But as I stood there, on the threshold of oblivion, a different memory surfaced. Not a memory of the Harrisons in life or death, but a memory of my own. It was the memory of my ordination, decades ago, in the great cathedral at Exeter. The feel of the bishop's hands on my head, the weight of the stole upon my shoulders, the vows I had taken not just to God, but to the sanctity of individual human souls. I had vowed to shepherd them, to protect the flickering, divine flame within each person. The entity's offer was the absolute antithesis of that vow. It was not unity, it was assimilation. It was not peace, it was the silence of the hive. The love it offered was not the challenging, redemptive love of Christ, but the possessive, consuming love of a predator that cherished its prey even as it devoured it. The faces in the light, I realized with a jolt of horrific clarity, were not the Harrisons. They were The entity had consumed their memories, their patterns, their essence, but it could not replicate the ineffable spark of a soul created in the image of God. What I was seeing was a masterful forgery, a painting so perfect it could almost fool the subject's own mother. But almost was not enough. To accept this was to declare that the unique, individual souls of Charles, Eleanor, Clara, and Flora were expendable, that their destruction was a fair price for this collective consciousness. It would be the ultimate betrayal of my vocation, of my friendship, and of my humanity. A surge of defiance, born not from strength but from the last embers of a dying faith, coursed through me. I snatched my hand back as if burned. The warmth of the light suddenly felt cold, predatory. "No," I said. The word was a dry croak, barely audible, but it echoed in the silent cottage with the force of a thunderclap. The luminous presence recoiled. The serene faces contorted, not into anger, but into a profound, cosmic confusion. The chorus of voices faltered. "Why?" the entity asked, and its tone was genuinely perplexed, like a child rejected after offering its favorite toy. "The loneliness ends. The pain ends. We offer you eternity." "Eternity as what?" I cried out, my voice gaining strength. "A ghost in a machine? An echo in a chorus? You are not them. You are a collection of stolen memories. You offer me a family, but you murdered the one that was here. I will not sanctify that crime with my acceptance. I will not be the final brick in your blasphemous monument." The light pulsed violently, and for a moment, the unified presence shattered back into its individual components. I saw the Charles construct, its face a mask of pained betrayal. I saw Eleanor's shimmering form, her hands clasped as if in prayer. I saw the girls, their expressions confused and frightened. It was a brutal sight, a pantomime of a family being torn apart, and I knew it was a final, manipulative ploy. "I acknowledge your existence," I shouted, stepping back, putting physical distance between us. "I acknowledge your power, but I deny your right to these souls. I deny your version of peace. My vigil is over. This ends now." A sound emerged from the coalescing light, a low, resonant tone that was neither a hum nor a growl, but the sound of deep, primordial disappointment. The light began to dim, the forms within it fading like stars at dawn. The presence in the cottage receded, pulling back from me, from the house, flowing like a retreating tide back toward the lake. The last thing to vanish was the image of Clara. She looked at me, and for a fleeting second, the ancient light in her eyes was gone. I saw only the little girl I had known, and she smiled, a sad, grateful smile. Then she too was gone. I was alone. Truly, utterly alone. The cottage was empty, silent, and cold. The haunting was over. I had refused the abyss, and in doing so, I had condemned myself to the loneliness I had feared. But as I stood there, trembling in the sudden silence, I felt something I had not felt in a year, the fragile, defiant spark of my own indivisible soul. It was a small, cold flame, but it was mine. The silence that descended after the entity's withdrawal was of a quality I had never before experienced in my long life. It was not merely an absence of sound, but a profound emptiness that seemed to swallow even the memory of noise. The cottage, once vibrating with unnatural presences, now stood as a hollow shell, its very timbers seeming to groan with the weight of their sudden solitude. I remained motionless for what felt like an eternity, my limbs locked, my breath caught in my chest, waiting for some final trick, some last, cruel manifestation. But none came. The air itself felt different, lighter, cleaner, scoured of the psychic residue that had polluted it for so long. The oppressive humidity of another consciousness had lifted, leaving behind the simple, crisp chill of a late autumn night. I was, irrevocably and utterly, alone. In the stark, gray light of dawn, the full impact of my refusal became palpable. The haunting had been a nightmare, but it had also been a perverse form of companionship. Now, the cottage was simply a small, damp building on the edge of a vast wilderness. The familiar objects, Charles's chair, Eleanor's knitting basket, the children's forgotten toys, were no longer charged with sinister meaning. They were just objects, pathetic relics of a tragedy that was now, finally, complete. The silence was so deep I could hear the scurrying of mice in the walls, the settling of the foundation stones, the slow, rhythmic beating of my own heart. This was the peace I had chosen, not the false unity of the hive mind, but the austere, terrifying freedom of individual existence. The following weeks were a period of intense and painful convalescence, not of the body, but of the spirit. My mind, so long accustomed to being probed and pressured by an external force, now had to relearn how to function independently. Memories returned with shocking clarity, unpolluted by the entity's distortions. I remembered Charles's genuine, slightly pedantic laugh, Eleanor's quiet strength, the unadulterated joy in the children's faces, not as the entity had presented them, but as they truly were. The grief that washed over me was clean, sharp, and human. It was the grief of a friend and pastor mourning his flock, not the confused horror of a man haunted by their stolen echoes. I wept for them, proper tears for the first time, and in that weeping I began to reclaim my own soul. My relationship with the lake transformed entirely. I resumed my walks along its shore, but now I saw it with new eyes. It was a body of water, ancient and deep, yes, but no longer a sentient enemy or a wounded god. It was a part of nature, magnificent and indifferent. The triple circle symbol did not appear again. The water lost its unnatural warmth and its occasional, faint luminescence. The entity had retreated to such profound depths that its presence was no longer detectable. It was as if a fever had broken, and the land itself was returning to a state of health. Birds returned to the trees around the cottage. Fish jumped in the lake. The balance, it seemed, had been restored not through negotiation, but through a definitive severance. By refusing to become a part of its consciousness, I had forced it to recede back into its own isolated realm. Knowing my time was limited, the years of strain had etched themselves permanently into my frail frame, I dedicated myself to a final, crucial task, the preservation of this chronicle. I became an archaeologist of my own nightmare, meticulously transcribing every event, every emotional tremor, every theological crisis onto these pages. I did not shy away from recording my moments of weakness, my near surrender, my heretical curiosities. This account had to be unflinchingly honest to serve its purpose. It could not be a sanitized testament of faith. It had to be a map of a journey through hell, complete with all the wrong turns and dead ends. I included Charles's journal, the relevant passages from the old parish history, and my own detailed sketches of the symbols and the island's layout. This box was to become a reliquary of the unbelievable. I arranged for its delivery with a solemnity usually reserved for state affairs. I summoned John Crocker, who arrived at the cottage with palpable trepidation. I presented him with the sealed metal box, its weight significant with the burden of truth it contained. I looked the old fisherman in the eye, and I saw not fear, but a dawning understanding. He had witnessed enough to know that the evil had passed, and he sensed that this box was somehow connected to its passing. I did not explain its contents. I simply instructed him that, upon my death, he was to take it directly to the bishop's office in Exeter. I made him swear on his hope of salvation to see it delivered. He nodded, his gnarled hand resting on the box with a strange reverence. "I'll see it done, Vicar," he said, and I knew he would. The truth was now in the hands of fate. The final winter has come. The world outside my window is a monochrome landscape of white snow and gray sky. The cold seeps into the cottage, but it is a natural cold, one that can be fought with firewood and wool blankets. I feel a profound tiredness in my bones, a weariness that speaks of a long race finally run. There is no fear in me. I have faced terrors far beyond the simple cessation of breath. The grave holds no mystery for me anymore. It promises only rest. As I write these final words, the fire crackles in the hearth, casting dancing shadows that are once again just shadows. The chronicle is complete. My vigil has ended. I have kept the faith, though not in the way I once imagined. I remained true not to a doctrine, but to the sanctity of the individual human soul. That, I believe, is a victory that any God would recognize. Let this account stand as a warning to future generations. Let it be a testament to the resilience of the human spirit against forces that would seek to absorb it. And let it be a memorial to the Harrison family, not as they were twisted by the lake, but as they lived. Charles, Eleanor, Clara, and Flora. May they finally find the peace in God's grace that was so cruelly denied them on this earth. The night is here. My work is done. Thomas Harris. Blackwood Lake. December 24, 1898.